Daddy for the November rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, each drop racing down the glass like tears against the city lights 40 stories below. Margaret Hayes stood in the marble foyer, her cleaning cart beside her, staring at the grandeur that still took her breath away even after 6 months of weekly visits. The apartment belonged to Richard Ashford, one of those tech billionaires whose face occasionally appeared in Forbes or on the financial news channels her late husband used to watch. She checked her phone. 7:45 in the morning. Mr. Ashford's assistant had sent the usual Tuesday message the night before, confirming that the apartment would be empty and she should let herself in with the key code. The penthouse was silent except for the rain and the distant hum of the city waking up below. Margaret had learned to appreciate these solitary mornings, the meditative quality of restoring order to spaces where extraordinary wealth lived. At 53 years old, Margaret had been cleaning homes for nearly 2 decades, but the last 3 years had been different. After Tom's sudden heart attack, the medical bills had devoured their savings faster than she could have imagined. Their modest house in Queens was gone now, sold to pay debts. She lived in a studio apartment in Astoria, took 3 buses to reach her clients in Manhattan, and worked 7 days a week to keep her head above water. Her daughter, Sarah, was in her final year at Columbia Medical School, a dream that Margaret refused to let die along with everything else they had lost. The penthouse sprawled before her like a museum of modern excess. Minimalist furniture that probably cost more than a year of her salary, abstract art on the walls that she secretly found ugly, and a kitchen with appliances so sophisticated she was afraid to touch half of them. But Mr. Ashford was rarely here, his assistant had explained. He traveled constantly, stayed in hotels, lived out of suitcases. This $10 million apartment was more investment than home. Margaret began her routine in the living room, dusting the shelves lined with books that looked unread, their spines too perfect, arranged by color rather than any system that suggested actual use. She moved methodically, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of her work. Spray, wipe, move forward. Her hands knew the motions so well she could let her mind drift, usually to Sarah, wondering if her daughter had eaten breakfast, if she was sleeping enough, if the pressure of medical school was too much. The master bedroom was at the far end of the penthouse, behind double doors that always stood open. Margaret pushed her cart inside, taking in the enormous space dominated by a king-sized bed with sheets so white and crisp they looked untouched. The room smelled faintly of expensive cologne, though she had never seen any personal items lying around. Everything was always in its place, sterile and perfect. She was changing the bed sheets, her back to the walk-in closet, when she heard it, a soft, muffled sound that made her freeze. A cough, someone clearing their throat. Her heart lurched, and she spun around, clutching the Egyptian cotton sheets to her chest like a shield. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended, barely audible over the rain still pounding the windows. "Mr. Ashford, I'm sorry. I thought you were traveling. Your assistant said—" No response. The closet door stood slightly ajar, darkness beyond it. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. She thought about leaving, just walking out and calling the assistant, explaining she had heard something. But what if it was nothing? What if she looked foolish, overly dramatic? She needed this job. The pay was exceptional, and Mr. Ashford's assistant had hinted that if Margaret continued to do excellent work, there might be other properties to clean, other wealthy clients to refer. "I'm going to call security," Margaret said, louder now, trying to sound braver than she felt. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket, fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. The closet door opened fully, and a man stepped out into the dim bedroom light. Margaret gasped, stumbling backward against the bed. It was Richard Ashford, but not the composed, perfectly groomed man from the photographs she had seen online. His usually neat dark hair was disheveled, standing up in places like he'd been running his hands through it. He wore expensive pajamas, wrinkled and twisted, and his face was unshaven, shadows under his eyes so dark they looked like bruises. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Please don't scream," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know this looks insane. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you." Margaret's thumb hovered over the emergency call button. "What are you doing in there? Why didn't you answer when I called out? Your assistant said you were in Singapore." Richard Ashford ran a hand through his hair, making it worse. He'd looked around his own bedroom as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps as if he no longer recognized it. "I was supposed to be in Singapore. I was on my way to the airport yesterday when I just couldn't. I turned the car around, came back here, turned off my phone. I've been hiding in that closet since I heard you come in. I didn't want you to see me like this." "Like what?" Margaret asked, though she could see it now. The exhaustion radiating from him, the defeated slope of his shoulders, the way he looked everywhere except directly at her. This was not the confident billionaire from the business magazines. This was someone barely holding himself together. "Like a complete mess," Richard said, attempting a laugh that came out more like a cough. "Like someone who's supposed to have his life figured out, but has absolutely no idea what he's doing anymore." He moved to the edge of the bed and sat down heavily, his head in his hands. "You should go. I'll pay you for the full day. I'll pay you for the rest of the month. Just please don't tell anyone you saw me here. Tell my assistant I wasn't home." Margaret should have left. Every instinct told her to back away from this strange situation, to protect herself from whatever chaos was unfolding in this rich man's life. But something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was the rawness in his voice, a pain she recognized because she had heard it in her own voice 3 years ago when Tom died. Maybe it was simply that she had spent so many months cleaning this empty apartment, building a mental image of its absent owner, and this broken man sitting on the bed matched none of her assumptions. "Have you eaten?" The question surprised them both. Margaret had not planned to say it, but there it was, hanging in the air between them. Richard looked up at her, confusion crossing his face. "What? Food? When did you last eat something?" Margaret set her phone down on the nightstand, a gesture that felt significant, a decision being made. "Because you look like you're about to pass out, Mr. Ashford." "Richard," he said automatically, "if you're going to find me hiding in my closet, you might as well call me Richard." He thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe. I had coffee." "Coffee isn't food." Margaret heard herself using the same tone she used with Sarah when her daughter tried to survive on cafeteria coffee and granola bars during exam weeks. "You have a kitchen full of appliances worth more than my car, and you're living on coffee." "I don't know how to use most of them," Richard admitted, something almost like a smile flickering across his face before dying. "I eat at restaurants or hotels. Someone else always makes your food," Margaret finished. "Right. Well, I know how to use a stove and a pan, fancy or not. Stay here, don't move. I'm going to make you breakfast, and then you're going to tell me why a billionaire is hiding in his own closet from his own life." She did not wait for his agreement, just turned and walked out of the bedroom, her heart still racing but her hands steady now. The penthouse kitchen gleamed around her, all stainless steel and marble, intimidating in its perfection. Margaret opened the massive refrigerator, grateful to find it stocked with basics. Eggs, butter, bread, some vegetables that looked fresh enough. Someone must come to provision the place even when Richard was not here. As she cracked eggs into a bowl, Margaret realized she had just inserted herself into a situation that was none of her business. She could lose this job. She could be accused of overstepping, of being inappropriate. But something about the look on Richard Ashford's face when he stepped out of that closet had reached past all her professional boundaries and touched something deeper, simple human recognition of another person in pain. The eggs sizzled in the pan, and Margaret found herself talking to the empty kitchen. "Tom, I hope I'm not making a huge mistake here, but you always said I had good instincts about people." She plated the scrambled eggs, added toast, poured orange juice into a glass that probably cost more than her entire dish set at home. She arranged everything on a tray and carried it back to the bedroom. Richard had not moved. He sat on the edge of the bed exactly as she had left him, staring at nothing. When Margaret set the tray on the nightstand beside him, he looked at it as if he had forgotten what food was. "Eat," Margaret said firmly, "and then we'll talk." He picked up the fork slowly, took a bite, and something changed in his expression. His eyes closed, and for a moment Margaret thought he might cry. This is the first real food someone has made for me in... He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't even remember. Thank you. Margaret pulled over the sleek desk chair and sat down, maintaining a professional distance but not leaving. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. Somewhere far below, Manhattan rushed through its Tuesday morning, millions of people starting their days, pursuing their dreams, fighting their battles. And up here, 40 stories above it all, a cleaning woman and a billionaire sat in unexpected silence, about to begin a conversation that would change both their lives forever. Richard ate slowly, mechanically, but he finished everything on the plate. When he set down the fork, he finally looked directly at Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. A desperate kind of hope, fragile as glass. "Why are you being kind to me?" he asked quietly. "You don't know me. I'm just another client. You could have walked out." Margaret considered the question, thinking about all the houses she had cleaned, all the lives she had glimpsed through their possessions and arrangements. She thought about her own life, the losses and struggles, the way strangers had sometimes helped her when she needed it most, expecting nothing in return. Because 3 years ago, when my husband died and I thought I was going to drown in debt and grief, a stranger at the hospital sat with me for 2 hours while I cried. She didn't know me. She didn't have to stay. But she did, and it saved me that day. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "We all need someone to see us when we're hiding, Richard. Even billionaires." Richard Ashford stared at Margaret for a long moment, his expression shifting through surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked like relief. He set the empty plate aside and leaned back against the headboard, closing his eyes as if the simple act of eating had exhausted him. "I'm 42 years old," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've built 3 companies from nothing. I've been on the cover of magazines. I've given TED Talks about innovation and perseverance. And 2 weeks ago, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I felt anything real. Not happiness, not sadness, not even anger. Just nothing. Empty." Margaret listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. Outside, the November sky was growing lighter, though the rain showed no signs of stopping. The city below was invisible, behind sheets of water streaming down the glass. "My father died when I was 16, Richard continued, opening his eyes to stare at the ceiling. "Heart attack, just like that. One day he was teaching me to drive. The next day he was gone. My mother never recovered. She's in a memory care facility in Connecticut now, early onset Alzheimer's. She's 68 and doesn't remember my name most days." He laughed bitterly. "I visit her every Sunday when I'm in the country, and every Sunday she asks me who I am." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly, thinking of her own mother who had passed 5 years ago, grateful that at least her mother had known her until the end. "I started my first company when I was 23, right out of college. Everyone said I was crazy, that I'd fail, that I was too young. I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to build something my father would have been proud of, something my mother could brag about to her friends before the disease took her." Richard's hands clenched into fists on the expensive sheets. "I succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Made my first million by 25, first billion by 35, and somewhere along the way, I forgot why I was doing any of it." Margaret watched him carefully. She had cleaned enough wealthy homes to know that money did not solve the problems people thought it would. She had seen medicine cabinets full of antidepressants, divorce papers left on kitchen counters, family photos gathering dust because the people in them no longer spoke to each other. Wealth was just another costume, another way of hiding. 2 weeks ago, I was in a board meeting, Richard said. We were discussing layoffs. 800 people across 3 divisions. The CFO was showing me spreadsheets, talking about efficiency and profit margins, and all I could think about was that these were real people. People with families, with mortgages, with kids in college. People like... He stopped, looking at Margaret directly. "People like you." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of the vast distance between their lives and the strange intimacy of this moment that was bridging it. I approved the layoffs, Richard continued, his voice hollow, because that's what CEOs do. That's what success looks like in my world. You make the hard decisions. You maximize shareholder value. You don't let emotions interfere with business. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. And then I went back to my hotel room that night and couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Couldn't think about anything except those 800 people whose lives I'd just destroyed with a signature. Margaret remained silent, sensing he needed to say all of this, to unburden himself to someone who had no stake in his world, no agenda, no expectations. I started having panic attacks, Richard admitted, his breath fogging the window. The first one hit me during a presentation to investors. I was mid-sentence, talking about projected growth, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I thought I was dying. My assistant called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, it was over. The doctors said it was anxiety, stress, that I needed to slow down. He laughed harshly. Slow down. They don't understand. In my world, slowing down means falling behind. It means losing everything. Or maybe it means finding yourself again, Margaret suggested quietly. Richard turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face. What? You said you can't remember the last time you felt anything real. Maybe that's because you've been moving too fast to feel anything at all. Maybe slowing down isn't about losing. Maybe it's about remembering who you are underneath all the success and the money and the expectations. Richard walked back to the bed and sat down heavily, his shoulders slumping. I don't know who that person is anymore. I wake up every morning in a different city, a different hotel room. I eat breakfast with people whose names I can't remember, discussing deals I don't care about. I come back to this apartment maybe once a month, and when I do, it feels like a museum, not a home. I have everything and nothing at the same time. Margaret thought about her own small studio apartment in Astoria, the narrow bed, the kitchenette barely big enough for one person, the single window that looked out onto a brick wall. She thought about how she had cried herself to sleep in that space for months after Tom died, how empty it had felt, how much she had hated coming home to silence. But slowly, she had made it hers. She had hung photos of Sarah, of Tom, of her mother. She had bought a small plant that somehow survived her irregular watering schedule. She had learned that a home was not about size or luxury, but about the life you built inside it. This apartment is beautiful, Margaret said carefully, but you're right, it doesn't feel lived in. It feels like a showroom, like you're a guest in your own life. Exactly, Richard said, looking at her with something like gratitude. That's exactly what it feels like. I'm a guest everywhere I go, even in my own skin. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city. 40 stories below, people were rushing to work, hunched under umbrellas, dodging puddles. Each of them carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of hiding in closets from lives that had become too much to bear. After Tom died, Margaret said, not looking at Richard, I felt like I was underwater. Everything was muffled and distant, and I kept thinking I just needed to hold my breath a little longer, just get through one more day, and eventually I'd surface. But days turned into weeks, into months, and I was still underwater. Still just surviving, not living. What changed? Richard asked softly. Margaret turned to face him. My daughter, Sarah. She was in her first year of medical school, and she wanted to quit, to come home and take care of me. She was willing to give up her dream because she thought I couldn't make it without her. Margaret's voice grew stronger, and I realized that if I let her do that, if I let my grief destroy both our futures, then Tom's death would have taken everything from us. So I stopped just surviving. I started fighting. I took on more clients, worked harder than I ever had in my life, not because I wanted to, but because I had to, because giving up wasn't an option anymore. Richard listened intently, his earlier exhaustion replaced by something else, a kind of hunger for the truth she was offering. I'm not going to tell you I have all the answers, Margaret continued. I'm not going to say that hard work and determination solve everything, because they don't. There are still days when I wake up and miss Tom so much I can barely breathe. There are still nights when I lie awake worrying about money, about whether I'll have enough to help Sarah if she needs me, about whether this endless working will ever lead to something better. She walked back to the chair and sat down, meeting Richard's eyes directly. But I know who I am. I know why I get up every morning, and that makes all the difference. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Outside, the rain began to lighten, the sky brightening to a pale grey. The sound changed from a hammering to a steady patter, almost peaceful. "I was supposed to be in Singapore for a merger," Richard finally said. $20 billion, 18 months of negotiations, hundreds of people depending on this deal going through. And yesterday morning, sitting in the car on the way to the airport, I realized I didn't care. Not about the money, not about the company, not about any of it. I told my driver to turn around, came back here, turned off my phone, and crawled into that closet like a child hiding from a thunderstorm. "And then I showed up," Margaret said. "And then you showed up." Richard managed a small smile. "I thought about staying hidden, letting you clean around me, pretending I wasn't here. But then I heard you changing the sheets, humming to yourself, and I thought, what am I doing? This is insane. So I came out." "I'm glad you did," Margaret said honestly. "Though I'm still not sure what I'm supposed to do now. I've never had a client confess an existential crisis to me before. Usually I just clean and leave and never see the people who live in these places." What do you think I should do?" Richard asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question, a genuine desire for guidance from someone outside his usual world of advisors and consultants and yes-men. Margaret considered carefully. "I think you should take a shower, get dressed, and eat a real meal. Then I think you should call your assistant and tell her you're not going to Singapore. Not because you're hiding, but because you need time to figure out what you actually want from your life. And then—" She paused, weighing her next words. "Then I think you should start living in this apartment instead of just owning it. Living in it how? Cook a meal in that kitchen. Read one of those books on your shelf. Look out these windows and actually see the city instead of just passing through it. Make this place feel like a home instead of a hotel. You said you don't know who you are anymore. Maybe it's time to find out." Richard stood slowly, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I have a board meeting on Thursday. Investor calls scheduled for the next 3 days. A dinner with the mayor tomorrow night that's been planned for months. So cancel them," Margaret said simply. "Or don't, but stop hiding and start choosing. There's a difference between being overwhelmed by your life and actively deciding what your life should look like." He looked at her with something like wonder. "How did you get so wise?" Margaret laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "I'm not wise. I'm just a cleaning lady who's learned that the only way through the hard things is straight through them, not around them or away from them. You can't hide in closets forever, Richard. Eventually you have to come out and face whatever you're running from. And if I don't know what I'm running from, then you start by standing still long enough to figure it out." The rain had stopped entirely now, the city emerging wet and glistening below them. Sunlight broke through the clouds in scattered beams, illuminating patches of Manhattan like a spotlight searching for something important. Margaret walked to the bedroom door, then turned back. "I'm going to finish cleaning," she said. "You're going to take that shower and get dressed. And when I'm done, we're going to sit in that fancy kitchen of yours, and you're going to tell me about one thing, just one thing, that used to make you happy before all this success happened. Can you do that?" Richard nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression, a tiny spark of determination replacing some of the exhaustion. "Yeah, I think I can do that." Margaret returned to her cleaning cart in the hallway, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the past hour began to wear off. She had just inserted herself into a billionaire's breakdown, offered advice she had no business giving, and completely abandoned every professional boundary she had ever maintained. She could lose this job. She could be escorted out of the building by security. She could be blacklisted from every wealthy client in Manhattan. But as she heard the shower start running in the master bathroom, as she began dusting the living room shelves with renewed purpose, Margaret felt something she had not felt in a long time. the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. Sometimes the most important cleaning was not about dust and dirt. Sometimes it was about clearing away the clutter that obscured a person's ability to see their own life clearly. She would finish her work, sit with Richard in his kitchen, and listen to whatever story he needed to tell. And then, tomorrow, she would return to her regular schedule, her regular clients, her regular life. But today, for whatever reason, the universe had placed her in this penthouse at precisely the right moment to see someone who desperately needed to be seen. Margaret smiled to herself as she polished a glass coffee table, remembering the stranger who had sat with her at the hospital 3 years ago. Maybe this was how it worked. Maybe we were all just meant to show up for each other when the hiding became too much to bear alone. Margaret finished cleaning the living room as the sounds of the shower echoed through the penthouse. She worked methodically, but her mind was racing, replaying the conversation in the bedroom, wondering if she had overstepped, if she had been too familiar with a man she barely knew. Yet something about the rawness of the moment had felt right, necessary even, like finding someone drowning and pulling them to shore without stopping to question whether you were qualified to be a lifeguard. 40 minutes later, Richard emerged from the bedroom wearing dark jeans and a simple grey sweater, his hair damp and combed back, his face clean-shaven. He looked like a different person from the dishevelled man who had stumbled out of the closet. More composed, certainly, but still carrying that same exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that sleep could not fix because it came from somewhere deeper than physical fatigue. "Better?" Margaret asked, looking up from where she was organizing the books on the shelf by something more sensible than color, a small act of rebellion against the interior designer's sterile aesthetic. "Better," Richard confirmed, though his voice remained uncertain. He walked to the kitchen island and leaned against it, watching as Margaret put away her cleaning supplies. "I called my assistant, told her I wasn't going to Singapore, that I needed a few days. She sounded like I'd told her the world was ending." "Maybe her world," Margaret said carefully, "but not yours. Your world gets to be whatever you decide it is." Richard managed a small smile. "She's rescheduling everything. The board is not happy. Neither are the investors. I'm apparently single-handedly destroying shareholder confidence by taking 3 days off. Then they'll survive 3 days without you, which means you're not as indispensable as you think you are." "And that's actually good news." Margaret washed her hands at the kitchen sink, marveling again at the faucet that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "So, you promised to tell me about one thing that used to make you happy, before all this." She gestured at the expensive apartment around them. Richard was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the marble countertop. Then his expression shifted, something distant and almost wistful crossing his face. "Cooking," he said finally. "When I was a kid, my dad and I used to cook together every Sunday. Nothing fancy, just regular food. Pancakes, burgers, pasta. He said that a man who could feed himself and others would never be helpless in the world." Richard's voice grew softer. "After he died, I stopped. It hurt too much to be in the kitchen without him. And then I went to college, started the company, and suddenly I was always eating at restaurants or ordering takeout or grabbing whatever was fastest. I haven't actually cooked a meal in probably 20 years. Margaret felt her heart constrict at the loneliness in his voice. 20 years of not doing something that had once brought joy, 20 years of running so fast that he had left pieces of himself scattered behind, like breadcrumbs he could never find his way back to. "Then that's what we're going to do," Margaret said decisively. "We're going to cook something, right now, together." Richard looked startled. "Now? But you're working." "I shouldn't keep you from your other clients." "You're my only client today," Margaret said, which was not entirely true. She had 2 other appointments in the afternoon, but something told her they could wait. "And I'm officially extending my services to include teaching a billionaire how to use his own kitchen. Consider it a bonus." For the first time since she had met him, Richard laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "All right. But I'm warning you, I might be hopeless. I can barely work the coffee maker." "Everyone starts somewhere," Margaret said, opening the refrigerator and surveying the contents. Let's see what we have to work with here. Eggs, butter, vegetables, some chicken breast, pasta, tomatoes, garlic, basil. We can make something simple. Pasta with fresh tomato sauce. Your dad teach you that one? Richard joined her at the refrigerator, looking at the ingredients as if seeing them for the first time. Yeah, summer pasta, he called it. He used to make it when the tomatoes were ripe in my grandmother's garden. She lived in New Jersey, had this little house with a backyard full of tomato plants. We'd visit her on weekends, and my dad would pick tomatoes right off the vine, still warm from the sun. Then summer pasta it is, Margaret said, pulling out ingredients and setting them on the counter. Even though it's November, and these tomatoes definitely didn't come from your grandmother's garden. But we work with what we have, right? They stood side by side at the kitchen island, and Margaret began giving instructions. First, we boil water for the pasta. That's the big pot. Second cabinet on the left. She watched as Richard retrieved it, filled it with water and set it on the stove, his movements uncertain but deliberate. Now we prep the tomatoes. Have you ever diced a tomato? I've cut open a bagel, Richard offered, and they both laughed. Margaret showed him how to core the tomatoes, how to dice them into even pieces, how to mince the garlic without crushing it. Richard worked slowly, carefully, his hands gradually finding a rhythm. She watched him relax incrementally, his shoulders dropping, his breathing evening out. There was something meditative about cooking, she had always thought, something that grounded you in the present moment, in the simple physical acts of chopping and stirring and tasting. My daughter wants to be a surgeon, Margaret said as they worked. She's in her 4th year of medical school at Columbia. Watching her study, seeing how precise she has to be with her hands, it reminds me that cooking is its own kind of surgery. You're transforming ingredients, creating something new, and the details matter. Columbia Medical School, Richard said, impressed. That's extraordinary. You must be so proud. Every single day, Margaret said softly. She's the reason I keep going. After Tom died, after we lost the house, after everything fell apart, she was the one thing I couldn't let fail. I'd work 100 hours a week, clean 1,000 apartments, do whatever it took to make sure she could finish school without drowning in more debt than necessary. Richard paused in his chopping, looking at her with new understanding. That's why you work so hard. That's why you're here at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning. That's why I'm everywhere, Margaret confirmed. I have 6 regular clients plus fill-in work when other cleaners can't make their appointments. I work 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Last vacation I took was 3 years ago, right before Tom's heart attack. We went to the Catskills for a weekend. It rained the entire time. She smiled at the memory. But we didn't care. We played cards in the cabin, talked about what we'd do when we retired, made plans that would never happen. I'm sorry, Richard said quietly, about your husband, about everything you've lost. Margaret shrugged, though the gesture did not quite hide the pain that still lived in her chest. We all lose things. The question is what we do with what remains. I could have given up, let the grief swallow me, let Sarah sacrifice her dreams to take care of me. But that would have meant Tom died for nothing, that all the years we spent building a life together were wasted. So I chose to keep building, even though he's not here to see it. The water began to boil, and Margaret instructed Richard to add salt and pasta. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the bubbling water and the sizzle of garlic hitting hot olive oil in the pan. The kitchen filled with rich, warm smells that made the sterile penthouse suddenly feel more alive, more human. I haven't had anyone to build anything with in a long time, Richard said as he stirred the tomatoes into the garlic and oil. I've had relationships, but they always end the same way. The women I meet are either attracted to the money and the lifestyle, or they're intimidated by it. Nobody sees me, just the fortune and what it represents. It's incredibly lonely. So date someone who doesn't care about money, Margaret suggested, tasting the sauce and nodding approval. Someone who has their own life, their own purpose. Someone who would be fine, whether you were a billionaire or a bus driver. Where do I find someone like that? Richard asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Everyone in my circles has money or wants money. It's the language we all speak. I don't even know how to meet people outside that world anymore. Margaret thought about this as she drained the pasta, steam rising around her face. You start by living a real life instead of a curated one. You go to places where real people go, coffee shops, parks, bookstores, community centers. You do things because you want to, not because they look good on social media or impress business associates. You become a person instead of a persona. Richard plated the pasta, spooning the fresh tomato sauce over it, adding torn basil leaves and a drizzle of olive oil, just as Margaret instructed. They carried their plates to the dining table, an enormous slab of polished wood that looked like it had never been used for an actual meal. Richard opened a bottle of wine from a climate-controlled cabinet, poured 2 glasses, and they sat down across from each other. The pasta was simple but delicious, the tomatoes sweet and acidic, the garlic pungent, the basil fresh. Richard took his first bite and closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet with tears he did not bother hiding. "This tastes exactly like my dad's," he whispered. "Exactly. I didn't think I'd ever taste this again." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. "Then your dad is right here with you. That's the magic of cooking. It's memory made tangible. It's love that you can taste." They ate in silence for a while, the rain having stopped completely now, weak November sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Margaret glanced around the penthouse, seeing it differently now, not as a showroom or a museum, but as a space with potential, a canvas waiting for someone to actually live on it. "What would you change?" Richard asked suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "About this place. If you lived here, what would you do differently?" Margaret considered the question seriously, looking at the color-coordinated books, the abstract art, the furniture arranged for aesthetics rather than comfort. "I'd make it messy," she said finally, "in a good way. I'd put photos on the walls, real photos of real people you care about. I'd leave a book open on the coffee table, spine up, marking your place. I'd put a throw blanket on the couch, the kind you actually use when you're cold, not the kind that matches the decor. I'd have dishes in the sink sometimes, coffee cups on the counter, signs that a human being actually lives here and does human things." "The cleaning lady is telling me to make more mess," Richard said with a smile. "That's ironic." "I'm not telling you to make mess," Margaret clarified. "I'm telling you to make life. There's a difference. Mess is chaos. Life is evidence of living. When I walk into an apartment that's too perfect, I always feel sad. It means nobody's really home. They're just stopping by their own existence." Richard set down his fork, his plate half finished, but Margaret could see he was full in a way that had nothing to do with food. "I want to pay you," he said, "not just for cleaning today, but for this. For the conversation, for the cooking lesson, for reminding me that life can be more than conference calls and quarterly earnings." "You already paid me," Margaret said. "For the cleaning, I mean. That's what our arrangement is. This, the talking, the cooking, that was just 2 people being human together. You don't owe me anything for that." "But I want to do something," Richard insisted. "You said your daughter is in medical school. Let me help with her tuition, her expenses. Consider it an investment in the next generation of doctors." Margaret's spine stiffened, her expression cooling. "No, thank you, but no. I don't take charity, Richard. Not from you, not from anyone. I've worked for everything Sarah has, and I'll keep working for everything she needs. That's not pride, that's dignity." Richard held up his hands in apology. "I didn't mean to offend you. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and you're working yourself to exhaustion to help your daughter. It seems unfair." "Life is unfair," Margaret said simply, "but accepting your money would change something between us. Right now, we're just 2 people who happened to meet at the right moment. You needed someone to see you, and I was here. That's random and beautiful and human. But if money gets involved, if I become another person on your payroll or another charity case on your conscience, then all of this means something different, something less." Richard studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm so used to solving problems with money that I forgot not everything can or should be solved that way. It's okay, Margaret said, her expression softening. I know you meant well. But the best thing you can do for me is figure out your own life. Stop hiding, start living, and maybe, if you want, tell me about it the next time I come to clean. That's all I need. They finished their meal, talking about smaller things now, easier things. Richard told her about the tech companies he had built, the innovations he had helped bring to market, and Margaret was surprised to find herself genuinely interested, asking questions about how things worked, why certain decisions were made. Richard, in turn, asked about her life before Tom died, and she told him about their small house in Queens, about the garden Tom had planted every spring, about the life they had built together, modest but full. As Margaret prepared to leave, gathering her cleaning supplies, Richard walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said, "for everything today, for not leaving when you found me in the closet, for making me cook, for reminding me that I'm still a person underneath all the other things I've become." "We all need reminding sometimes," Margaret said. "Just promise me you'll use that kitchen again. Don't let it go back to being decoration." "I promise," Richard said, and she believed him. Margaret rode the elevator down 40 floors, walked out into the cold November afternoon, and caught the first of 3 buses that would take her back to Astoria. As she rode through Manhattan, watching the city pass by outside rain-streaked windows, she thought about the strange morning, about finding Richard hiding in his closet, about the conversation over pasta that had felt more real than most of the interactions she had with people she had known for years. She pulled out her phone and texted Sarah, "Had the most unusual day at work. Tell you about it later. Love you. Eat something that's not coffee." Sarah's response came quickly. "You always have the best stories, Mom. Love you too. Already ate, I promise." Margaret smiled, tucking her phone away. The bus rumbled on through the city, carrying her toward her next appointment, her next client, her next chapter of the endless work that filled her days. But something had shifted inside her, some small restoration of faith in the random kindness of the universe, in the possibility that sometimes we meet exactly who we need to meet exactly when we need to meet them. And 40 stories above Manhattan, in a penthouse that felt slightly less like a museum and slightly more like a home, Richard Ashford stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the city he had conquered but never really seen, and wondered what it might be like to start over, to build a life instead of just a fortune, to be known instead of just successful. The question hung in the air like a promise, waiting for an answer that would take more than one afternoon to find. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Richard felt something other than emptiness. He felt possibility. The 3 weeks passed before Margaret returned to the penthouse. Richard's assistant had sent the usual messages, confirming appointments that Margaret had to decline due to her packed schedule. She worked her other clients, scrubbed bathrooms and mopped floors, dusted shelves and organized closets, moving through the wealthy apartments of Manhattan like a ghost who witnessed lives without ever truly touching them. But she thought about Richard often, wondered if he had cooked again, if he had stopped hiding, if their strange afternoon together had made any difference at all, or if he had simply returned to his old patterns once she left. It was mid-December when she finally climbed back into the elevator that rose to the 40th floor. The city was decorated for Christmas now, lights strung across streets, department store windows displaying elaborate winter scenes, the air cold and crisp with the promise of snow. Margaret carried her cleaning supplies and a small bag containing something she had debated bringing for days. A cookbook that had belonged to her mother, its pages stained and dog-eared, filled with simple recipes and handwritten notes in the margins. She entered the apartment using her key code, expecting the usual silence, the usual emptiness. Instead, she heard music playing softly from the living room, something classical she did not recognize, and she smelled coffee brewing. Her heart quickened as she set down her cart. "Hello?" she called out, wondering if she was about to discover Richard hiding in another closet, if the progress she had hoped for had been an illusion. "Margaret!" Richard's voice came from the kitchen, warm and surprised. "I didn't know you were coming today. My assistant must have forgotten to tell me." She walked into the kitchen and stopped, genuinely shocked by what she saw. Richard stood at the stove, wearing an apron over jeans and a sweater, stirring something in a pot. The kitchen counter was cluttered with ingredients: onions, carrots, celery, a whole chicken broken down into parts, fresh herbs. Dishes sat in the sink, a cutting board showed evidence of recent use, and a cookbook lay open beside the stove, its pages splattered with olive oil. "You're cooking," Margaret said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Actually cooking." "I'm attempting to cook," Richard corrected, gesturing at the pot with his wooden spoon. "Chicken soup, my grandmother's recipe, or at least my attempt at it. I've already ruined 2 batches this week, but I think I'm getting closer." He looked different, she realized, more rested, less haunted. He had color in his cheeks and light in his eyes that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Margaret set down her supplies and walked to the stove, peering into the pot. The soup looked good, the broth golden and fragrant, the vegetables tender. "This smells amazing. What made you choose chicken soup?" "It's December," Richard said simply. "My grandmother used to say that December required soup, that you couldn't properly survive winter without it. I woke up one morning last week and realized I hadn't had real homemade soup in years, maybe decades. So I found her old recipe in a box of my mother's things and decided to try." Margaret noticed other changes too. The color-coordinated books on the shelves had been rearranged, mixed up now, some lying on their sides, others with bookmarks protruding from their pages. Photographs in simple frames sat on the side tables, pictures of people she assumed were Richard's family, a man who must have been his father, a woman with kind eyes who might be his mother in younger days, a little boy who was clearly Richard himself, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. A throw blanket was draped over the back of the couch, forest green and well-used. The apartment looked lived in now, imperfect and human. "You've been making changes," Margaret observed, walking through the living room, taking in all the small transformations. "The place looks completely different. You told me to make it messy in a good way," Richard said, following her with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one. "To make it look like someone actually lives here. So I started unpacking boxes I hadn't opened in years, pulling out things that mattered, putting away things that didn't. The interior designer would probably have a heart attack, but I don't care. It feels like mine now, like home." They sat on the couch together, and Margaret felt the shift in their dynamic, the ease that came from having shared something real. Richard was no longer just a client, and she was no longer just his cleaning lady. They had become something else. Friends, perhaps, or something without an easy label. 2 people from completely different worlds who had found unexpected common ground. "Tell me what else has changed," Margaret said. "Besides the cooking and the decorating." Richard set down his coffee cup, leaning back against the cushions. "I've been going to therapy 3 times a week. I fought it at first, told myself I didn't need it, that I could figure things out on my own. But then I remembered what you said about going straight through the hard things instead of around them. So I found a therapist who specializes in high-achieving individuals dealing with burnout and anxiety, and we've been working through a lot." "That's good," Margaret said encouragingly. "That's really good, Richard." "It's hard," he admitted. "Harder than running a company, harder than any business deal I've ever negotiated. Having to sit there and talk about my father's death, my mother's illness, the emptiness I've been feeling, the panic attacks. Having to admit that success didn't fix any of the broken things inside me, that maybe it made some of them worse. But it's helping. I can feel it helping." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of support. "And what about work? The board, the investors, all those people who weren't happy about you taking time off?" Richard laughed, a sound that held both bitterness and liberation. "I stepped down as CEO 2 weeks ago, moved myself to chairman of the board, brought in someone else to run day-to-day operations, someone who actually wants to be in Singapore for merger negotiations, who lives for the quarterly earnings calls and the investor presentation, someone who isn't me." Margaret's eyes widened. "That's huge. How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Richard said honestly, "and relieved, and free in a way I haven't felt since I was 23 and starting my first company. I spent almost 20 years building these businesses, pouring everything I had into making them successful. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that success was supposed to be a means to an end, not the end itself. I built a fortune so I could have freedom, and then I let the fortune imprison me. So what are you going to do with your freedom? Margaret asked. Besides cooking soup and rearranging furniture? Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city lit up in the late afternoon darkness, Christmas lights twinkling like earthbound stars. I'm not entirely sure yet. I know I want to spend more time with my mother, even if she doesn't remember me. My therapist helped me understand that I was avoiding the visits because they were painful, but the pain is part of love, part of showing up for the people who matter even when it's hard. So I've been going to see her 3 times a week instead of once. I sit with her, tell her stories about my dad, about my childhood. Sometimes she knows who I am, sometimes she doesn't, but I'm there. That's what matters. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, thinking about her own mother, grateful again that she'd been able to say goodbye properly. She's lucky to have you, even if she can't always remember it. I'm also starting a foundation, Richard continued, turning back to face her, using some of my wealth to do something meaningful. I want to focus on supporting families dealing with sudden financial crises, medical bankruptcies, the kind of situations where everything falls apart overnight. Places that help people like you after your husband died. I can't fix what happened to you, but maybe I can help prevent it from destroying other families. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Richard, that's beautiful. That's exactly the kind of thing the world needs. I was inspired by you, he said simply, by your strength, by the way you kept fighting when everything fell apart. I have resources that most people don't, and I've been wasting them on accumulating more resources instead of using them to actually help. That changes now. They talked for over an hour, Margaret forgetting entirely about the cleaning she had come to do. Richard told her about the foundation's plans, about the conversations he had been having with non-profit leaders and community organizers, about the families he hoped to help. Margaret told him about Sarah's progress in medical school, about her daughter's excitement over a surgical rotation, about the exhausting but rewarding grind of supporting a dream that was slowly becoming reality. I brought you something, Margaret said finally, retrieving the bag she had left by the door. She pulled out the old cookbook, its cover faded and worn, and handed it to Richard. This was my mother's. It's full of the kind of recipes your dad and grandmother probably made. Simple, honest food. I thought you might like to have it. Add it to your collection. Richard took the cookbook with reverent hands, opening it carefully, reading the handwritten notes in the margins, the splatters and stains that told stories of meals cooked and shared. Margaret, I can't take this. It's too precious. It's your family history. And now it can be part of yours, Margaret said firmly. My mother would have loved knowing her recipes were helping someone find their way back to themselves. Besides, I have all of them memorized. I don't need the book, but you do. You need the connection to something real, something that matters. Richard's eyes filled with tears, and this time he did not hide them. Thank you. This means more than you know. I know exactly what it means, Margaret said softly. That's why I brought it. The soup timer went off in the kitchen, and Richard jumped up to check it. Margaret followed, watching as he tasted it, adjusted the seasoning, tasted again. She could see the joy in his face, the satisfaction of having created something with his own hands, something that nourished rather than merely impressed. It's ready, Richard announced. Will you stay and have some? Please? I made enough to feed an army, and I'd love to share it with someone who actually appreciates what it represents. Margaret glanced at her watch. She had other clients waiting, other apartments to clean, other schedules to maintain. But looking at Richard, at the soup he had made, at the home he was building from the ruins of his empty success, she found herself nodding. I'd love to, but only if we eat at that dining table and use real napkins and actually sit down like civilized human beings. Deal, Richard said with a grin. They ladled soup into bowls, sliced fresh bread that Richard had bought from a bakery that morning, his first time actually walking into a neighborhood store in years. They sat at the dining table that was no longer pristine and unused, but showed signs of regular meals, of life happening on its surface. They ate the soup that tasted like memory and hope, like tradition carried forward, like one man's journey back to himself. "I've been thinking," Richard said halfway through the meal, "about what you said about meeting real people, about living a real life. I joined a cooking class every Thursday evening, downtown. It's full of regular people who just want to learn to cook better. Nobody knows who I am, nobody cares about my bank account. We just chop vegetables and follow recipes and talk about normal things." Margaret smiled widely. "That's perfect. Have you made any friends?" "Maybe," Richard said, looking almost shy. "There's a woman in the class, a high school teacher named Elena. She's funny and smart and completely unimpressed by anything except whether I can properly julienne a carrot. We've been getting coffee after class. Nothing romantic, at least not yet, but it's nice. It's normal. It's what I imagine people do when they're not building empires or hiding in closets." "Adil, I'm so proud of you," Margaret said, and she meant it with her whole heart. 3 weeks ago, you were at rock bottom, unable to face your own life. And now look at you. You're cooking, you're in therapy, you're visiting your mother, you're starting a foundation, you're taking cooking classes and maybe dating a teacher. You're doing the work. "I couldn't have done it without you," Richard said seriously. "Without you showing up that morning, without you refusing to let me keep hiding, without you treating me like a person instead of a checkbook or a job or whatever else people see when they look at me. You gave me permission to be human again." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You gave yourself permission, Richard. I just happened to be there when you were ready to stop hiding. That's all any of us can do for each other. Witness each other's courage, support each other's growth, show up when it matters." They finished their soup in comfortable silence, and then Richard insisted on washing the dishes while Margaret finally did some actual cleaning, though she worked around him now, their movements synchronized like dance partners who had practiced together for years instead of hours. The apartment smelled like soup and lemon cleaner and coffee, smells that meant home in any language, in any tax bracket. As Margaret prepared to leave, Richard walked her to the door again, but this time the goodbye felt different, less like an ending and more like a continuation, a story still being written. "Same time next week?" Richard asked. "I promise I won't be hiding in any closets, but I might be making bread. Fair warning, the kitchen gets very messy when I bake." "And messy kitchens are the best kind," Margaret said. "And yes, same time next week. Maybe I'll bring some of my mother's bread recipes. They're even better than the soup." "I'd like that," Richard said. "And Margaret, thank you for everything. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for reminding me that money can't buy the things that actually matter, for being exactly who you are, which is pretty extraordinary." Margaret hugged him then, a brief embrace that bridged the vast distance their lives had traveled to reach this moment. "You're going to be okay, Richard. Better than okay. You're going to build a life that actually means something. I can see it happening already." She rode the elevator down 40 floors, walked out into the December cold, and caught her buses home to Astoria. But this time, the work did not feel endless. This time, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes, in the middle of cleaning someone else's space, you help them clean out their life. And sometimes, that was worth more than any paycheck, any schedule, any amount of exhaustion. That night, Margaret called Sarah and told her the whole story, from finding Richard in the closet to eating soup at his dining table, from the cookbook she had given away to the foundation he was starting. Sarah listened quietly, and when Margaret finished, her daughter was crying. "Mum, do you realize what you did?" Sarah said through her tears. "You saved someone's life, not with medicine or surgery, but with kindness and truth, and just being present when he needed someone most. That's what I want to do as a doctor, not just fix bodies, but see people, really see them. Then you're going to be an amazing doctor," Margaret said softly. "Because you already know the most important thing, that healing starts with witnessing someone's pain and refusing to look away." They talked late into the night, mother and daughter, about the strange ways lives intersect, about the power of showing up, about the difference between success and significance. And when Margaret finally fell asleep in her small studio apartment, she dreamed not of the endless work ahead, but of all the lives she had touched without even realizing it. All the spaces she had cleaned that were really hearts being opened. All the moments she had witnessed that mattered more than she could ever know. 40 stories above Manhattan, Richard Ashford sat in his newly lived-in apartment, reading through Margaret's mother's cookbook, planning the meals he would make, thinking about the foundation he would build, considering the life he was finally beginning to live instead of just survive. On his kitchen counter sat a framed photograph he had printed that afternoon, a picture he had asked Margaret if he could take, the two of them standing in his kitchen, soup bowls in hand, smiling like old friends, like family, like two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and changed everything. The city sparkled below, millions of lives unfolding in millions of apartments, each person carrying their own struggles, their own hiding places, their own moments of being seen. And in one penthouse on the 40th floor, a man who had thought he lost himself in success was slowly finding his way back. One soup recipe at a time, one therapy session at a time, one act of showing up at a time. Margaret had been right. We all need someone to see us when we're hiding. And sometimes the universe arranges for a cleaning lady and a billionaire to meet in a closet, for a moment of truth to pierce through years of running, for two very different lives to remind each other what it means to be human. The rain had stopped 3 weeks ago, and the sun was finally breaking through, and so we reached the end of another unforgettable journey. If this story touched your heart, stirred your emotions, or simply made you feel something, you can help me in 3 simple ways. Leave your like. It's quick, free, and shows me I'm on the right path. Subscribe and turn on the bell to never miss our upcoming stories. Comment below what moment struck you the most in this story. Every like, every subscription, every comment motivates me to bring you more engaging, emotional stories full of twists and turns. And if you know someone who would love this story, share it. Sometimes a good narrative is exactly what someone needs for their day. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.